Iran is entering a moment when the skies are swept clean. The fleet closes in, allies pull back, and while the world watches the radar, the most dangerous question lies underground. Who is hiding and who is preparing to strike? If you want to understand how a country with a powerful military, a vast missile arsenal, and 45 years of history could collapse before the first shot is fired, stay with us until the end of this video. And if you're interested in geopolitical analysis that cuts straight to the heart of power, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the seismic shifts that are reshaping our world. There are moments in history when war hasn't yet begun, but the ending is already taking shape. Not through the sound of bombs, nor the rumble of tanks rolling across borders, but through something far more elusive: absence. The absence of leadership, of a reassuring voice, of the image of power appearing exactly when it's needed most. Iran is stepping into such a moment. In recent days, Iran's skies have taken on a strange stillness, not because of thick clouds or sandstorms, but because of total silence above. Airports that were once busy have gone eerily empty. Commercial flight paths have vanished from the global aviation map as if they never existed. On civilian radar screens, the familiar glowing dots, symbols of life, of commerce, of a nation in motion, have gone dark one by one. In modern warfare, when the skies are cleared, it's rarely a sign of peace. It signals that civilian airspace is being handed over to military use. When passenger jets are no longer allowed to fly, it means other objects are being readied to cross those same skies, with entirely different intentions. At the same time on the ground, an even more unsettling vacuum is spreading. The man regarded as the spiritual and political pillar of the Iranian regime, the supreme leader, has disappeared from public life. No calming speeches, no presence at religious ceremonies, no moments of direct contact with the people during a time of crisis. In a theocratic state, this silence isn't just a security tactic. It's a blow to the very foundation of the regime's legitimacy. When the one believed to be divinely protected fails to appear in moments of peril, faith begins to crack in ways no military unit can patch. There's no need for calls to overthrow the government, no need for mass protests. It only takes quiet, whispered questions spreading through society. If the one at the top is in hiding, who will bear the storm when it hits? Throughout history, many regimes have fallen not because they lacked weapons, but because they lost the ability to show up psychologically. When power is no longer seen, it starts to lose its force. When fear changes direction, systems of control naturally become hollow. And in that context, seemingly dry technical signals, like international airlines simultaneously rerouting, canceling flights, and pulling out of the region, become the clearest of warnings. Because civilian aviation doesn't respond to emotion or political statements. It responds to risk probability. When the skies remain empty, not for hours, but for days on end, the real question is no longer what is happening. It becomes what's about to begin. And to truly understand that moment before 0 hour, we must look up at those empty skies, where the silence is saying more than any public threat ever could. When war still lingers on the edge of no shots fired, there is one industry that sees it coming before anyone else: civilian aviation. Not because they have military satellites or spy networks, but because every decision to fly or not to fly is calculated by a probability of life or death. For airlines, the sky holds no gray areas. It is either safe or it's not. And when risk crosses a certain threshold, the reaction is swift, coordinated, and cold, without need for announcements. In the days when Iran was gripped by tension, international flight routes around the region began to disappear. Not flight by flight, but entire networks vanished from the map. Pilots received rerouting orders from far away. Insurance companies adjusted risk levels within hours. Airports that once served as the nation's gateways fell into an eerily unnatural silence. This isn't an overreaction. In modern military doctrine, the act of clearing civilian airspace is a foundational step. Once there are no more passenger planes, no more civilian signals in the mix, every object in the sky that follows can be considered a legitimate target. Cruise missiles can fly low without fear of misidentification. Stealth aircraft can operate in optimal conditions. Electronic jamming systems can be activated at full strength without risking unintended civilian catastrophes. In other words, when civilian airspace is frozen, The theater of war has been unlocked. What's terrifying is this phase rarely lasts long. In many past conflicts, the window between airlines pulling out and the first strikes being launched is measured in days, sometimes in hours. It is the moment when diplomacy recedes into the background, making way for decisions that no longer need to be explained publicly. For Iran, that empty sky is more than just a warning of incoming airstrikes. It's a signal that the entire defense apparatus is entering a state of trial. Because once civilian aviation disappears, the next guests that appear on radar will no longer be harmless. And it's precisely here that the true nature of modern warfare reveals itself. Before a single bomb drops, before a single cannon fires, another confrontation unfolds in total silence. No explosions, no live news coverage, only invisible electromagnetic waves sweeping across the sky. It's the moment radars light up, signals are scanned, and frequencies are locked down. It's when war is no longer measured by the number of soldiers or tanks, but by the ability to see and to stay unseen. And from the empty skies of civilian aviation, the most dangerous battle begins. The electronic war, where radar matters more than artillery, and a single mistimed signal could decide the fate of an entire nation. In modern warfare, the most dangerous moment isn't when bombs start falling, it's when the radar screen suddenly lights up. That's when a nation is forced to choose between two terrible options: either let the enemy fly overhead without reacting, or power up its air defense system, and in doing so, expose the entire structure of its defenses. Radar is not just an eye, it's a voice, a digital signature, a confession without interrogation. Every time it's turned on, it reveals location, frequency, power, scan rhythm, and how the system responds to unknown targets. For the adversary, this is gold. For the defender, it's the most fragile moment of all. Deep penetration reconnaissance flights are not navigation errors. They are deliberate provocations, calculated down to the kilometer. The goal isn't to attack right away, but to force the opponent to speak. When Iran's radar activates to track an intruder, a full picture of its air defense network begins to unfold on the other side of the screen. Not just fixed radar stations, but also command chains, data links, response times, and the deadly gaps between layers of defense. Electronic warfare doesn't need explosions. It unfolds in silence at the speed of light. Signals are intercepted, analyzed, archived. The tiniest vulnerabilities, the kind that might be overlooked in peacetime, become fatal weak points in war. No matter how advanced a defense system is, if it's forced to power up reactively, it becomes like a lighthouse casting its own position into the dark. In that picture, the arrival of foreign military transport flights carries a meaning far beyond any diplomatic statement. They're not delivering humanitarian aid. They're not symbols of solidarity. They are an urgent effort to buy time to patch up an electronic curtain that's being torn apart. Time to train radar crews, time to integrate systems, time to hope that when the critical hour comes, everything will work as it should. But electronic warfare doesn't wait for anyone to be ready. It rewards the one who moves first and punishes hesitation. Every minute of delay means another layer of data is captured. Every radar activation adds another puzzle piece to the enemy's targeting map. And when a country realizes its skies are not just being watched, but understood, the impact isn't just technical. It sinks deep into the national psyche. It creeps into closed-door meetings. It slips into brief, quiet exchanges between officers and officials. The feeling of being constantly seen, of having every move anticipated, creates an invisible but overwhelming pressure. And in that atmosphere, when invisible eyes have locked onto both sky and ground, another void begins to emerge more clearly than ever. Not on radar, but in the political arena. When a defense system is exposed to its core, the question of the safest shelter is no longer purely military. It becomes a personal question for the one at the very top. And that's when the leader's disappearance is no longer just a rumor. It becomes a psychological collapse for the entire regime. In a secular state, a leader's absence can often be explained as a simple security measure. But in a theocracy where power is intertwined with religious faith, that absence carries a very different weight. It's no longer just a matter of personal safety. It becomes a warning sign that the bond between authority and legitimacy is being stretched to a dangerous limit. Iran's supreme leader is not merely a head of state. He is a symbol of divine protection, the embodiment of the sacred order the regime claims to uphold. When that image vanishes from public life, especially during moments when society desperately needs a spiritual anchor, the message is unmistakable, even without explanation. Even the one at the top is trying to distance himself from the storm. In religious ceremonies, that absence echoes louder than any opposition criticism. There are no posters, no fiery speeches calling for revolt. There's just an empty space where a familiar face should be, and millions of people begin to ask silent questions of their own. When faith begins to falter, it doesn't collapse with a roar. It cracks quietly, then spreads like a fracture in a foundation. This disappearance sends shockwaves through the corridors of power. In the military and security apparatus, morale doesn't decline because of a lack of weapons, but because of a lack of confidence that the one above is willing to share in the risk. When the leadership vanishes from public view, every subordinate starts calculating for themselves. Orders are weighed more cautiously. Decisions get delayed. Responsibility is pushed upward toward a position that now sits empty. A regime doesn't fall just because its leader disappears, but it begins to lose the ability to self-correct. When all eyes turn upward and find nothing to hold on to, the system shifts from a mode of control to defense and eventually to survival. That's when power stops functioning as a cohesive force and begins to fracture into a web of personal fears. And it's in that moment that the outside world begins to make its own assessments. Allies see the vacuum and realize that the cost of standing beside Iran is rising fast. Strategic partners begin to recalculate their interests. As signals grow weaker from the center of power, external commitments grow increasingly fragile. The leader's absence doesn't just shake the regime from within, it sends a cold message to the outside. Iran is more alone than ever. And in that empty space, the most critical decisions are no longer being made in Tehran, but in Moscow, in Beijing, where allies and partners are quietly weighing whether to withdraw, to hesitate, or to continue tying their fate to a regime that is losing its strategic foothold. When a regime enters the vortex of instability, the reactions of its allies often speak louder than any diplomatic statement. In Iran's case, the signals coming from abroad at this moment carry the cold, calculated tone of power politics, who's still standing by and who's quietly stepping away. Russia was the first to show clear signs of retreat. Moscow didn't need to offer lengthy explanations. A simple advisory urging its citizens to leave Iran was enough for analysts to understand. The strategic parachute is being folded up. Entangled in another grinding war, Russia no longer has the military, economic, or political bandwidth to underwrite a high-risk front. In the language of geopolitics, this isn't betrayal, it's survival. When the benefits no longer match the costs, withdrawal becomes inevitable. China, meanwhile, is more subtle and more hesitant. Beijing cannot afford to ignore Iran, given their energy ties and long-term interests in the region's security architecture. Iran is not just a partner, but a key piece in a much larger strategic puzzle, where oil, shipping lanes, and political influence are tightly interwoven. But precisely because of that, China is unwilling to stake everything on a regime that's showing signs of instability. Any support it offers comes with caution, is indirect, and always carries conditions. There are no pledges of direct confrontation, no signals of willingness to absorb major losses to keep Iran afloat. Beijing wants to buy time, hoping the storm will pass, or at least not erupt into full-scale conflict. But in international politics, buying time isn't always a wise strategy, especially when the other side has no intention of waiting. As Russia folds its parachute and China hesitates, Iran slips into a state of strategic solitude. Not total isolation, but a dangerous absence of strong enough commitments to generate real deterrence. In such a position, every defensive calculation becomes fragile. Partners see rising risk, officials begin thinking about personal exit plans, and the public can feel with growing clarity that the protective net from outside is wearing thin. A nation can endure sanctions for years. It can weather military pressure for a time, but it's far harder to survive when it loses both internal faith and external backing. Strategic solitude doesn't kill a regime instantly, but it makes every blow that follows exponentially more dangerous. And it's precisely at this crossroads that the defining question emerges. When no allies are left willing to shield you, when external pressure mounts alongside internal fracture, what comes first? A collapse driven from without or an implosion from within? Iran now stands on that razor-thin line, where history no longer waits for answers, but prepares to write its next chapter in the harshest way possible. When a regime teeters on the edge of collapse, history often presents two paths that sound similar, but are fundamentally different. One is regime change, a shift in power that is guided, intervened in, or supported from the outside. The other is regime collapse, an internal breakdown when the system loses its ability to function long before any decisive blow is dealt. Iran, at this moment, is drifting somewhere between those two currents, and it is precisely that ambiguity that poses the greatest danger. Regime change requires a clear alternative, an opposition force that is organized, legitimate, and capable of taking over the machinery of power. But Iran, as it stands, shows no signs of such a clean scenario. The opposition exists, dissenting voices grow louder, but there is no unified structure ready to immediately fill the vacuum if the current regime falls. That makes any direct foreign intervention fraught with the risk of prolonged chaos. Regime collapse, on the other hand, requires no detailed plan, no polished endgame. It happens when a state gradually loses its ability to make decisions, loses the trust of its people, and, most critically, loses the fear that once held society in order. When the public no longer believes the regime is untouchable, every tool of control begins to lose its grip, day by day. Orders are still issued, but it's no longer certain they'll be followed. Police are still visible, but their gaze has changed. Officials remain at their desks, but their minds are already mapping escape routes. In this context, external pressure doesn't replace the regime. It accelerates its unraveling. It doesn't overthrow the state, but it speeds up the internal breakdown. When citizens look up and see that the regime no longer enjoys unconditional backing from global powers, when they sense that the wall of fear has been breached with holes too wide to mend, the psychological shift is swift. Not through loud uprisings, but through a quiet retreat from the structures the regime depends on to survive. What's striking about a regime collapse is that the decisive moment rarely comes with symbolic images. There's no clear victory day, no live broadcasted surrender. There's just a morning when people realize that orders are no longer being obeyed, that power has become hollow even before it has been replaced. Iran is moving closer to that moment. Not because an invasion is imminent, but because the system is beginning to lose confidence in itself. And once a regime starts doubting its own existence, history rarely needs more than a gentle nudge for the wheels of collapse to begin turning. War may not have broken out, at least not in the way the world is used to seeing it. There are no images of missiles streaking across the sky, no earth-shaking declarations read out on national television. But history doesn't wait for those moments to begin recording. History takes note of the absences, the absence on radar, the absence in ceremonies, the absence in the chain of command, and most dangerous of all, the absence of belief. Today, Iran is living in those absences. A state once built on the aura of invincibility is slowly realizing that power doesn't vanish with a single strike, but with the gradual loss of its ability to make people believe in its presence. When the skies fall silent, when the leadership disappears from public life, when allies begin calculating their exits, these are not isolated events. They are part of a process. Slow, cold, and irreversible. History is rarely fair in the moral sense, but it is brutally precise when it comes to timing. Long-standing regimes don't collapse because they're militarily weak. They fall when they can no longer answer the fundamental question, who is in control? And when that answer becomes unclear, power begins slipping from the hands of those who once held it tightly. Whether the final outcome is an internal collapse or a major external shock, one thing is already certain. Iran's old era is coming to a close, not with a bang, but with a prolonged silence. And that silence may be the most damning indictment any system of power can face. What's unfolding is not just Iran's story. It's a reminder that in the 21st century, power is not measured by weapons or defense budgets, but by the ability to sustain belief. Belief from the people, from the institutions, and from the outside world. Once that belief changes sides, the wheel of history begins to turn in a direction no one can control. What do you think will happen next? Will Iran collapse from within, or will a major event push the region into war? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to keep following deep, deliberate geopolitical analysis that cuts to the core of global power shifts, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can stay with us through the world's next major turning points.